As Europe was engulfed in war in the summer of 1914, the Reichswehr marched prodigiously into battle, capturing the Belgian ports of Osten and Zeebrugge in one fell swoop. With a secure foothold on the Belgian coast, the German Empire could deploy its U-boats and destroyers across the English Channel, while completely bypassing the Royal Guard fleet in the North Sea. The situation was a major headache for the Royal Navy, who now had to face constant U-boat attacks right at their doorstep. By 1917, they were desperate for a solution, and disabling the ports of Zeebrugge became a priority. Even so, every plan to neutralize the port, from a naval bombardment to a large-scale landing, all the way to blocking the port canals with scuttled ships, was deemed deficient or too risky. Finally, after years of debate, the Royal Navy decided to launch an all-out attack that combined all of the previous plans in an extraordinary naval effort, not unlike assaulting a castle in the middle of the ocean. Pulling out the THORN. It had been almost 4 years since the onset of the war, and the Western Front was in a deadlock. Even so, Germany had conquered the port of Zeebrugge early in the war, and it had become an important staging area for their U-boat campaigns in the English Channel. Despite employing several countermeasures to mitigate the German naval power from Belgium, the Flanders forces, the U-boats and destroyers deployed from Osten and Zeebrugge had become a painful thorn for the Royal Navy. Fortunately for the British, the Zeebrugge port consisted of a narrow channel that connected it to the city of Bruges, and the small canal didn't allow for large capital ships. Eager to end the Flanders forces and their unyielding threat over the English Channel, the Royal Navy decided to implement a special operation to disable the German port once and for all. Several options were considered. Landing forces directly on the port and seizing control over the site was the ideal scenario, but Zeebrugge was extremely close to the German front line, and any landing, even if successful, would be pushed back in mere days, if not hours. Shelling the port into submission was another alternative. To accomplish the feat, they would need the oversized guns of their larger capital ships, which would be wholly exposed to German coastal defenses as they approached a firing position. Another way to disable the port was to sail large old ships to the very mouth of the canal and scuttle them, to stop any U-boats and destroyers from reaching the sea. Even so, reaching the mouth of the channel was a suicide mission, and the blocked ships would most likely be stopped long before getting there. After years of debate, the Royal Navy's high brass concluded that the best approach was to launch a massive operation combining the three tactics into one unprecedented raid, a three-pronged assault capable of disabling the German coastal guards just enough to allow 3 aging capital ships to reach the canal and shut it off permanently. Easier said than done. The Royal Navy assembled a formidable force of over 17 destroyers, 4 capital ships, and 3 block ships for the ambitious operation. The assailants would be led by the commander of the Grand Fleet himself, John Jellicoe, as well as Admirals Roger Keyes and Reginald Bacon. The idea was to use a heavy smokescreen to cover the force as it approached the port. Hidden from view, the ships, led by HMS Vindictive, would land an elite group of Marines right at the tip of the port's mole. Supported by the 15-inch guns of HMS Erebus and Terror, the Marines would secure the mole's guns, just as 2 demolition submarines would blow up the bridge connecting the mole to the port to stop any attempts at reinforcement. As the entire port's defenses would become heavily suppressed by the bombardment, the British would sneak 3 old Apollo-class vessels into the entrance to the port's canal, where they would be deliberately sunk to shut down the access to and from the German naval base. But as the Zeebrugge force arrived at the port on April 23, 1918, the situation immediately grew much more complicated than previously thought. At first, everything went according to plan. The British fleet deployed many small but swift motorboats that encircled their own fleet with a massive smokescreen intended to hide their advance toward the port. The winds were favorable, blowing the smoke right into the Germans, who could not see any of the approaching warships. However, The massive wall of smoke let the Germans know something was wrong, and they immediately began to fire blindly. Thanks to the smokescreen, HMS Vindictive and the two ferries, SS Iris and Royal Daffodil, made it most of the way to the port's fortified mole. But soon, before reaching their positions, the wind began blowing the other way, clearing their cover and revealing the massive capital ship to the German gunners. The guns in the mole immediately engaged the British capital ship, inflicting moderate damage to the deck. Dramatic landing. Amid the chaos, smoke, and fire, Vindictive slammed forcefully into the mole, connecting with the structure much further ahead than planned. But there was no turning back now. Close to 800 Royal Marines aboard Vindictive hastily set up their climbing ladders and began to climb into the mole. And as they approached the surface, they were met with ferocious machine gun fire and wild spotlights fervently watching their every move. The Marines were advancing much more slowly than planned, but they were gaining a foothold on the mole. Even so, Vindictive was drifting away from the mole, and SS Royal Daffodil had to come to the rescue, physically pushing the capital ship back into position to allow the rest of the Marines to land. As the men fought the Germans in the mole, the two demolition submarines sailed towards the small bridge, joining the mole to the port. Their role was critical for the mission's success. If the Germans were able to reinforce the place and push the landing Marines back, the block ships would not be able to get past the mole's guns. However, before the British could reach the bridge, one of the submarines ran aground, taking her out of combat. The other submarine, C-3, proceeded as planned, but now had the entirety of the operation's fate on her shoulders. The submarines had been configured to be abandoned a few dozen yards from the bridge. Then their explosives charges would take the structure out as the British crews escaped in motorboats. But now, with only one submarine left, Lieutenant Richard Sanford decided to take the vessel all the way to the columns under the bridge, risking his life for the sake of the mission. Just as German reinforcements approached the bridge, Sanford and his men set the fuse by hand, bailed from the submarine, and fled in a boat, barely escaping the rising flames of the explosion. In the end, the bridge was destroyed, and the German reinforcements could not relieve their comrades. Sanford would earn the Victoria Cross for his courageous actions that day. However, the mission was far from over. Blocking the canal. As the Marines continued to secure the mole, the British capital ships rained fire over the entire port, and the small motorboats attempted to cover the British vessels with smoke. At the same time, the Apollo-class British ships darted silently between the mole and the coast, in a sly attempt to reach the canal's mouth before the Germans learned what was going on. The British diversion tactics had paid off, with the three block ships making it most of the way to the canal without being detected. However, just before reaching their destination, the coastal guns pinpointed the block ships and began firing with everything they had. The leading boat, Thetis, became severely damaged and was entangled in a submarine net. Thetis had to be scuttled mere yards from the canal entrance, as the other two British ships rushed to make it inside before they met the same fate as their sister. Thetis' sacrifice had not been in vain, as she drew most of the enemy fire. As such, her sisters, Iphigenia and Intrepid, managed to pierce the canal entrance. Both ships beached horizontally on the canal to activate the large number of explosives they'd been carrying. The sailors then abandoned ship as the two armored cruisers sank, creating an immovable obstacle right in the middle of the channel entrance. Fortunately, the crew was immediately rescued by small motorboats sent to take them home. Escaping. Despite successfully blocking the canal, the Marines and sailors in the mole were in a desperate situation. The Germans' guns had become fixated on Vindictive, which was being slowly demolished, losing several of her guns and suffering untold damage to her upper decks. When the order finally came to board the ship again and withdraw, the situation in the mole and on board Vindictive was a nightmare. Most of the ship's weapons had been destroyed, and the men trying to return faced unrelenting German fire. Many of them would not survive the boarding process. Of the 740 men that landed that day, there were 366 casualties. But as the British ships finally escaped from the port, they learned their successful mission came at the cost of 550 losses. Vindictive then returned to Britain as a floating wreck. The damage inflicted on her was so massive that she would never again see combat, and would only serve as a block ship in another raid. Even so, the incredible accomplishment of the British Navy would earn those who participated over 200 decorations. And although the Germans eventually managed to get U-boats through the blockade during high tides, the enormous advantage that Zeebrugge had given them was forever gone. Thank you for watching our video. For more amazing war stories and the technology that made them possible, click on your screen and check out the rest of our Dark Documentaries channels. We publish new content regularly, so stay tuned.